When does God show the full extent of his love? Like, what is the moment? If we're going to be throwing out candidates of which moment in the Gospels or in the entire Bible demonstrates the full extent of God's love, what would we point to? Maybe we would point to a teaching, because teachings get a lot of press. Maybe we would point to a miracle, a resurrection, maybe the healing of the woman with the flow of blood. Or maybe we would even point to the cross, the point where Christ laid his life down in our place. The thing that I find fascinating is that there is an event in John's Gospel that actually has the introductory label, the full extent of God's love, to demonstrate the full extent of God's love. And it comes in John 13. John chapter 13 begins this way. It says, "It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he showed the full extent of God's love." That's the NIV 1984's translation. Some of the translations say he loved them to the end. But I like the NIV 1984's translation of this Greek phrase. To show the full extent of God's love. And what's fascinating is what follows. The scene that follows is not a teaching. The scene that follows is not a miracle. The scene that follows is not even the cross. The scene that follows in John 13 is where Jesus grabs a towel and a basin, and he washes the feet of his disciples. But it's easy to read over this passage and quickly assume that the whole point is just service. Even when you're the king, it's important to serve. That's true. But I think it's deeper than that. I actually think it's far more scandalous than that. There are only two disciples that are mentioned by name in John chapter 13. One of them goes by the name of Peter, and the other one goes by the name of Judas. In John chapter 13, Peter has this interesting exchange with Jesus in verse 6. It says, "He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, 'Lord, are you going to wash my feet?' Peter not feeling worthy, and a lot of us can relate with that. Jesus replied, 'You do not realize now what I am doing, but you will later understand.' 'No,' said Peter, 'you will never wash my feet.'" You know what's interesting? One of the things that disrupts our relationship with the Lord is the shame and the unworthiness that we feel about ourselves. This is what Peter teaches me here in John 13. It's incredible. He is so adamant that he is unworthy that he actually argues with the Lord. And then, later on in the chapter, in his shame, which I think is still blinding him to who God is, Peter even cries out, "Lord, why can't I follow you now?" Verse 37. "I will lay my life down for you." And yet we know how the story ends. Then in John chapter 18, Peter pulls out a sword to defend Jesus in Gethsemane, only to deny him 3 times. Peter's problem wasn't boldness. Peter's problem was shame. It blinded him to who he truly was and disrupted his relationship with the Lord. And yet, even though Jesus knows that Peter's shame will blind him, that Peter's shame will actually lead him to deny him, Jesus still washes his feet. That, to me, is a pretty incredible demonstration of love, but it gets more intense. Because notice in verse 2, a detail that is emphasized a couple of times through this scene. Verse 2, "The evening meal was in progress, and the devil had already prompted Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus." Why begin the text that way? Like, you begin the text with 2 things. First of all, you say that in the next scene, we're going to see the full extent of God's love. And the very next thing you say is that the devil had already prompted Judas to betray Jesus. It's interesting because that's the very thing that is brought up once again in verse 10. This time it's in red letters though. Jesus answered, those who have had a bath need only to wash their feet. Their whole body is clean. And you are clean, he's talking to Peter. And then Jesus says this, though not every one of you. You see, Jesus isn't unaware of Judas's relationship with Satan. You know what's interesting is Luke chapter 22 even suggests that before the Lord's Supper, where this takes place, the washing of the disciples' feet, before the meal, in Luke 22 it says that Satan had entered Judas. Verse 11, it says this, for Jesus knew who was going to betray him, and that is why he said, not every one of you is clean. 3 times in John chapter 13, it emphasizes that Satan had prompted Judas to betray Jesus. Here's the thing that is startling. 2 disciples are mentioned, Peter the denier, Judas the betrayer. And yet, Jesus still washes their feet. He knows what they both are going to do. And he still washes their feet. Which is even more startling when you realize the truth that verse 3 brings out. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power. Jesus could do anything in this moment. He could teach. He could give another miracle. He could even grab a sword and destroy the betrayer and the denier. Instead, what Jesus does is he grabs a towel and a basin and washes their feet. And what was that moment like? When Jesus locked eyes with Judas. Judas knowing what he was going to do. Jesus knowing what he was going to do. Judas knowing the intimacy that he already has with Satan. And Jesus knowing as well. See, the thing I find very fascinating about this text is that the only 3 names that are mentioned besides Jesus is Judas, Simon, and Satan. And how does Jesus respond? By washing their feet. We can learn from this. In our lives, it is so easy to serve only those that we are at one with, to serve only those that are like us, to serve only those that actually like us. But the full extent of God's love is demonstrated when we choose to serve even in the face of those that hurt us, even in the face of those that deny us, even in the face of Satan himself. My challenge for you this week is to experience and to express the full extent of God's love. Serve. Serve those that you know have hurt you. Serve those that you know are hurting you. And in the midst of that serve, don't do it out of spite. Don't do it to heap coals over their head. Do it instead as an act of worship. Because as you give the fullest extent of God's love to someone else, you will begin to experience the full love of God in you, for you. Something that I tend to find destroys all shame. I love you guys. Have a good week.